My husband said my miscarriage was God's plan, until I asked if his affair was too. He had no answer. The cramping started during Sunday service while Pastor Gerald was mid-sermon about trusting divine timing. I was 14 weeks pregnant and had felt fine that morning when Ethan and I drove to Cornerstone Community Church in his pristine white SUV. We sat in our usual third-row seats where the elders and their families always congregated, close enough to show commitment, but not so close we appeared desperate for attention. The first cramp felt like a pulled muscle low in my abdomen, sharp enough that I shifted in my seat and pressed my hand there. Ethan glanced over with his public smile, the one he wore for church people, and leaned close to whisper if I was okay. I nodded and tried to focus on Pastor Gerald talking about Job's suffering and how God's purposes were beyond human understanding. The second cramp hit harder, accompanied by a wet warmth between my legs that made my entire body go cold. I stood up quickly, too quickly, and stumbled past Ethan into the aisle. Heads turned as I rushed toward the bathroom at the back of the sanctuary, my face burning with embarrassment and something darker, something terrifying I didn't want to name yet. In the church bathroom with its floral wallpaper and framed scripture verses, I locked myself in a stall and pulled down my skirt to find blood soaking through my underwear and pantyhose. Not spotting, not the light pink discharge my pregnancy app said was sometimes normal. This was red and heavy and wrong. I sat on the toilet and felt something pass, felt my body expelling what it was supposed to protect. I couldn't breathe right, couldn't think past the immediate horror of what was happening in a church bathroom while hundreds of people sang hymns 30 feet away. I pressed toilet paper between my legs and tried to slow the bleeding, but it kept coming. My hands shook so badly I dropped my phone twice before managing to text Ethan. Something's wrong. Bathroom. Now. I sat there waiting, listening to the muffled music from the sanctuary, feeling my body continue to betray me in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. Every cramp felt like punishment, even though I knew logically that miscarriages just happened sometimes, that 14 weeks wasn't safe yet, that nothing I'd done had caused this. Ethan knocked on the bathroom door 5 minutes later. I heard his voice asking if I was okay, if I needed him to get someone. I unlocked the stall door and he saw me sitting there, saw the blood, saw my face. His expression shifted through several emotions too quickly for me to identify before settling on something that looked like frustration mixed with concern. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said, already pulling out his phone. "I can't walk out through the sanctuary like this," I told him, gesturing at my ruined clothes and the blood that wouldn't stop. He left and came back with his suit jacket, helped me tie it around my waist to hide the worst of it. We went out the side door that led to the parking lot, avoiding the main sanctuary. In the car, Ethan drove faster than usual while I pressed paper towels from the church bathroom between my legs and tried not to think about the baby we'd told everyone about last week during the church announcement time. The baby Ethan had prayed over at dinner every night, asking God to bless our growing family. The baby that was now leaving my body in pieces. The emergency room was busy for a Sunday afternoon. Ethan checked me in at the front desk while I stood there swaying slightly, feeling lightheaded from blood loss or shock or both. The intake nurse took one look at me and got me into a wheelchair immediately, asking questions about how far along I was and when the bleeding started. Ethan answered most of them because I couldn't form coherent sentences past the cramping that was getting worse. They took me back to a room with pale green walls and fluorescent lights that hurt my eyes. A young doctor with tired eyes examined me and confirmed what I already knew. I was having a miscarriage and there was nothing they could do to stop it. She explained my options in a gentle voice that somehow made everything worse. I could wait for my body to finish the process naturally, which might take days or weeks. I could take medication to speed things along, or I could have a procedure called a D&C where they would surgically remove the remaining tissue. She used the word tissue, but we both knew she meant baby. The baby Ethan and I had picked names for, the baby whose nursery we'd already started planning. Ethan held my hand while the doctor talked, his grip firm and steady. When she left to give us time to decide, he immediately started praying out loud. "Lord, we don't understand your plan, but we trust in your wisdom. We know you work all things together for good for those who love you. This loss is painful, but we accept it as part of your divine purpose." His voice was strong and certain, the same tone he used when leading prayer group at church. I stared at him while he prayed, at his closed eyes and slightly upturned face, and felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with the miscarriage. He was performing. Even here, even now, he was performing his faith like an actor hitting his marks. I pulled my hand away from his and he opened his eyes, looking confused. I told him I didn't want to hear about God's plan right now. I just wanted to make a medical decision and go home. His jaw tightened in that way it did when I disappointed him, when I failed to meet whatever standard he'd set that I couldn't see. "We'll talk about this later," he said quietly. "Right now, we need to make a decision together as a married couple." I chose the D&C because I couldn't stand the thought of walking around for days or weeks waiting for my body to finish expelling our baby. The procedure was scheduled for the next morning. They gave me medication for the cramping and instructions about not eating or drinking after midnight. Ethan drove us home in silence, his hands tight on the steering wheel. Our house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood full of young families, all of us trying to build the same acceptable middle-class Christian life. Inside, everything looked exactly as we'd left it that morning. The coffee mug still in the sink. The pregnancy book I'd been reading still open on the coffee table. Ethan went straight to his office and closed the door. I heard him on the phone, his voice low and serious. I stood in the kitchen feeling the cramping continue and wondering who he was calling, who needed to know right away that we'd lost the baby. My phone buzzed with texts from people at church asking if everything was okay, if I needed prayer. Someone had seen us leave through the side door and word had spread. That night, I couldn't sleep despite the pain medication making me drowsy. I lay in bed listening to Ethan breathe steadily beside me, already asleep or pretending to be. My mind kept circling back to his prayer in the hospital, to the certainty in his voice when he talked about God's plan. I'd been raised in the church too, had heard that language my entire life. Everything happens for a reason. God doesn't give us more than we can handle. Trust in his timing. The phrases were supposed to be comforting, but right now they felt like weapons, like ways to dismiss my grief and make it mean something it didn't. I got up and went to the bathroom, checking to see if the bleeding had slowed. It hadn't. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and let myself cry quietly so I wouldn't wake Ethan. Except I wasn't really worried about waking him. I was worried about him telling me to have faith, to trust the process, to remember that God knew what he was doing. I was worried that my husband would make my loss about theology, instead of letting it just be loss. The D&C procedure happened early Monday morning in a surgical center that smelled like antiseptic and floor cleaner. Ethan sat in the waiting room while they prepped me, starting an IV and explaining what would happen when I was under anesthesia. The anesthesiologist was kind, asking about my pain level and my anxiety level and whether I had questions. I asked if it would hurt afterward, and she said there would be cramping but nothing like what I'd experienced yesterday. She asked if I had support at home and I said yes automatically, even though I wasn't sure that was true anymore. They wheeled me into the operating room, and the last thing I remembered was counting backward from 10 and getting to 7. When I woke up in recovery, the cramping had shifted to a duller ache, and I felt empty in a way that was both physical and not. A nurse checked my vitals and told me everything had gone well, that the doctor would come talk to me soon. Ethan appeared beside my bed, his face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like I just had our baby surgically removed," I wanted to say. Instead, I told him I was tired and wanted to go home. The doctor came by before discharge to explain aftercare. No heavy lifting, no intercourse for 2 weeks. Expect bleeding and cramping for several days. Call if the bleeding became heavier than a normal period or if I developed a fever. She gave me a prescription for pain medication and told me to follow up with my OB in 2 weeks. She also handed me a pamphlet about pregnancy loss support groups and grief counseling. Ethan thanked her and took all the paperwork, organizing it neatly in the folder he'd brought from home. In the car, he asked if I wanted him to pick up the prescription or if I wanted to go straight home. I told him to get the prescription. We drove to the pharmacy and sat in the parking lot while we waited for it to be filled. Ethan checked his phone constantly, typing responses to messages I couldn't see. Finally, I asked who he was texting. "Prayer chain," he said without looking up. "People want to know how to pray for us." The idea of strangers praying about my miscarriage made my skin crawl, but I didn't have the energy to argue about it. At home, Ethan helped me to the couch and brought me water and the pain medication. He asked if I wanted anything to eat, but I wasn't hungry. He sat beside me and put his hand on my knee, his touch careful like I might break. "We need to talk about how we're processing this," he said. "I need to make sure you're not spiraling into bitterness or resentment against God." I stared at him, trying to understand how he'd made my grief about my spiritual state within 24 hours of the miscarriage. I told him I was processing it by feeling sad about losing our baby, which seemed like a normal human response. He squeezed my knee in a way that was probably meant to be comforting but felt controlling. "I understand you're sad. I'm sad too. But we can't let this shake our faith. We have to trust that God has a purpose in this suffering." Everything that came out of his mouth sounded like a sermon, like he was practicing his theology on me instead of just being my husband. I asked him if he could please stop talking about God's plan and just sit with me in the grief for one day. Just one day where we acknowledged this was terrible and painful without trying to make it mean something. His expression hardened, and he pulled his hand away. "That's exactly what I'm worried about," he said. "You're already letting this make you bitter. You're pushing away the only thing that can give you peace." I told him I wasn't pushing away God. I was pushing away his need to perform faith instead of actually feeling anything real. The words came out sharper than I intended, but I meant them. Ethan stood up abruptly, his face flushing red. "I'm trying to help you through this, Claire. I'm trying to be a good husband and a spiritual leader in our home. But you're making that impossible by attacking my faith." He didn't wait for me to respond. He grabbed his keys and said he needed to go to the church to meet with Pastor Gerald. that maybe talking to someone with more spiritual maturity would help him figure out how to handle my attitude. He left, and I sat there on the couch alone, cramping and bleeding, and realizing that my husband had just made my miscarriage about his hurt feelings, about his role as spiritual leader being questioned, about anything except the actual baby we'd lost. I took a pain pill and lay down on the couch, pulling a blanket over myself. My phone buzzed with messages from church friends offering prayers and meals and help with anything we needed. I responded to a few with generic thank yous, but mostly I just let the notifications pile up. I didn't want prayers. I didn't want casseroles. I wanted my husband to come home and hold me while I cried instead of running to the pastor every time I failed to perform grief correctly. Around 3 in the afternoon, my best friend Leah called. She'd heard about the miscarriage through the church prayer chain and wanted to check on me. I told her I was physically okay, but everything else was complicated. She asked if Ethan was taking care of me, and I hesitated too long before answering. She knew me well enough to hear what I wasn't saying. "I'm coming over," she said. "Don't argue with me." She showed up 30 minutes later with soup from the deli and actual human empathy. She sat on the couch beside me and let me cry without trying to fix it or explain it or make it mean something. When I told her about Ethan's reaction, about his prayers and his comments about God's plan, her face went tight with anger. "That's not okay," Leah said firmly. "You just lost a baby and he's worried about your faith attitude? That's manipulative bullshit wrapped in spiritual language." Hearing someone else name it made something crack open in my chest. I started crying harder, all the grief and anger and confusion I'd been trying to contain spilling out. Leah held my hand and let me fall apart without judgment. She told me I had every right to be angry at God, and angry at Ethan, and angry at the unfairness of losing a wanted pregnancy. She said grief didn't have to be tidy or spiritual or meaningful. Sometimes terrible things just happened, and the only appropriate response was to rage and mourn and fall apart. Her permission to feel everything without filtering it through theology felt revolutionary. We sat there for 2 hours while I told her everything. How Ethan had been increasingly focused on his image at church over the past year. How every conversation eventually became about biblical principles or spiritual growth. How I'd started to feel like his project instead of his partner. How this miscarriage had crystallized all of it into something I could finally see clearly. Leah asked carefully if I thought Ethan was having an affair. The question came out of nowhere, and I immediately said no. That wasn't the kind of man Ethan was. But even as I said it, I felt doubt creeping in. She pointed out that men who were obsessed with appearing righteous often had something to hide. That sometimes the loudest voices about purity and spiritual leadership were compensating for their own guilt. I told her Ethan wouldn't do that, but my voice sounded uncertain even to myself. Leah suggested I pay attention over the next few weeks, not out of paranoia, but out of self-protection. She said she'd seen too many Christian women ignore red flags because they wanted to believe their husbands were godly men. Before she left, she made me promise to call her if I needed anything, even just someone to sit with me in silence. After she was gone, I lay on the couch thinking about her question. Ethan had been working late more often recently. He'd been protective of his phone in a way he hadn't been before. He'd started going to the gym 4 mornings a week when he'd never been consistent about exercise. Small things I'd noticed but dismissed because I trusted him. Ethan came home around 7 that evening. He walked in looking calmer than when he'd left, like his time with Pastor Gerald had reset him somehow. He asked how I was feeling, and I said I was managing. He sat down in the chair across from me, not beside me on the couch, and said he'd had a good conversation with the pastor about navigating crisis in marriage. Pastor Gerald had reminded him that wives need extra grace and patience during emotional times, that I might say things I didn't mean because of hormones and grief. The condescension in his tone made my jaw clench. I told him I'd meant everything I said earlier, that I needed him to be my husband, not my spiritual supervisor, that I was allowed to grieve without it being a referendum on my faith. He sighed like I was exhausting him. "Claire, I know you're hurting, but you're letting that hurt make you resentful. You're pushing me away when you should be letting me lead us through this." I asked him what leading us through this actually looked like to him. He said it meant trusting God's sovereignty together, praying together, and not letting the enemy use this tragedy to create division in our marriage. Everything was a sermon. Every response was performance. That night in bed, Ethan tried to initiate physical intimacy. Not sex, just touching and closeness that felt like his way of declaring everything was fine now. I pulled away and reminded him the doctor had said no intercourse for 2 weeks. He said he knew that. He just wanted to feel connected to me. I told him I wasn't ready for any kind of physical connection when I was still bleeding from losing our baby. He rolled away from me, his body language radiating hurt. "I'm trying to comfort you," he said to the ceiling, "but you won't let me do anything right." I didn't respond because anything I said would start another fight about my attitude or my faith or my failure to let him lead properly. We lay there in tense silence until he fell asleep. I stayed awake thinking about Leah's question, about the gym visits and the phone protection and the late nights at work, about how Ethan had responded to the miscarriage with theology instead of emotion. about how quickly he'd left to talk to Pastor Gerald instead of staying with me. Little cracks in the narrative I'd believed about my marriage were starting to widen into chasms I couldn't ignore. Edit. The next morning, Ethan went to work like it was any other day. He asked before he left if I needed anything, and I said no. After he drove away, I got up and went to his office. Something I never did because he'd established early in our marriage that his workspace was private. I told myself I was just looking for insurance paperwork related to the hospital bills. That was a reasonable excuse if he came home and found me in there. His desk was organized with labeled file folders and a closed laptop. I opened the laptop and it immediately prompted for a password. I tried our wedding date and it didn't work. Tried his birthday. Tried my birthday. Nothing. The fact that he'd password protected his laptop when we'd never done that before felt significant. I started going through the desk drawers, not sure what I was looking for, but feeling compelled to look. In the bottom drawer under a stack of church bulletins, I found a credit card statement I didn't recognize. It was addressed to Ethan at a P.O. box I didn't know we had. The charges were from restaurants and hotels over the past 6 months. Dates I recognized as nights he'd said he was working late or at men's prayer group. My hands started shaking as I read through the charges. Dinner at an expensive steakhouse on a Thursday in January. A hotel room in the city on a Friday in February. Flowers from an upscale florist in March. Jewelry from a boutique in April. None of these purchases had appeared in our joint checking account where Ethan deposited his paychecks. He'd opened a separate credit card and was hiding these expenses completely. I took photos of every page with my phone, my heart racing so fast I felt dizzy. This was evidence of something. Maybe not an affair, maybe just financial infidelity. But either way, it was proof that Ethan had been lying to me for months. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, and went back to the living room. I sat on the couch staring at the photos on my phone, trying to make them mean something other than what they obviously meant. Trying to give my husband the benefit of the doubt, even though doubt was all I had left. I called Leah and told her what I'd found. She told me to send her the photos immediately, and not to confront Ethan until we had more information. Leah knew a private investigator through her work in family law. She called him and explained the situation, then called me back with his number. His name was Dennis Kowalski, and he agreed to meet me that afternoon at a coffee shop across town where no one from church would see us. I drove there still wearing pajama pants and one of Ethan's sweatshirts, not caring how I looked. Dennis was a stocky man in his 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. He listened while I showed him the credit card statements and explained about the miscarriage and Ethan's strange behavior. He asked straightforward questions without judgment. Had I noticed any other changes? Yes, the gym attendance and the phone protection. Any unexplained absences? Yes, the late nights at work that had increased over the past 6 months. Did Ethan have close female friends? I thought about the women at church, the ones who always sought him out after service to ask for prayer or advice. There was one named Bethany who'd been particularly attentive lately. Young, recently divorced, teaching Sunday school for the elementary kids. Dennis wrote down her name. He explained that surveillance would take about a week and cost $1,500. I had that much in my personal savings account from before I got married, money my grandmother had left me that I'd kept separate. I told Dennis to start immediately. He said he'd need Ethan's work schedule and any other information about his routine. I gave him everything I could remember, feeling like I was betraying my husband even though he'd apparently been betraying me first. Dennis said he'd be in touch once he had something concrete. I drove home feeling numb, the reality of what I was doing starting to sink in. I'd hired a private investigator to follow my husband. That wasn't something people in healthy marriages did. That was something people did when their marriages were already over, but they needed proof to make it real. Back home, I took more pain medication and lay down. The physical cramping from the miscarriage merging with the emotional pain of everything else into one terrible ache I couldn't separate or name. Ethan came home from work that evening with flowers and Chinese takeout. He said he'd been thinking about me all day and wanted to do something nice. The gesture felt performative, but I thanked him anyway because fighting required energy I didn't have. We ate at the kitchen table making awkward small talk about his day at work and my recovery. He asked if I'd thought about when we might try to get pregnant again. The question felt obscene given that I was still bleeding from losing our first baby. I told him I hadn't thought about it at all, that I was just trying to get through the next few days. He said he understood, but that Pastor Gerald had mentioned that sometimes the best way to heal from loss was to move forward with hope, that waiting too long might allow fear to take root. I set down my fork and asked him if he could please stop quoting Pastor Gerald for 5 minutes and have an original thought about our situation. His face went red and he said I was being disrespectful, that Pastor Gerald was a spiritual authority and his counsel was valuable. I asked when Ethan had started needing the pastor's permission to know how to treat his own wife. The argument escalated quickly from there. Ethan accused me of being rebellious and bitter. I accused him of hiding behind theology instead of actually dealing with emotions. He said I was letting grief make me mean. I said he was using my grief to avoid genuine connection. We said terrible things to each other across the kitchen table. Things that had probably been building for months but were finally breaking through the nice Christian couple facade we'd maintained. Finally, Ethan stood up and said he couldn't do this anymore, that he was going to stay at his brother's house until I got my attitude under control. He packed a bag and left without kissing me goodbye. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by cold Chinese food and wilting flowers, feeling the marriage I'd thought was solid crumbling around me. My phone buzzed with a text from Dennis. The surveillance had begun. He'd picked up Ethan leaving our house and was following him. I texted back asking him to let me know where Ethan ended up. 20 minutes later, Dennis confirmed that Ethan had not driven to his brother's house. He'd driven to an apartment complex on the other side of town and gone inside. I stared at the text message, feeling everything I'd feared crystallizing into certainty. Dennis sent me the address and apartment number. He asked if I wanted him to continue surveillance or if I'd seen enough. I told him to keep watching and document everything. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any decisions. That night, I barely slept, my mind spinning through possibilities. Maybe Bethany lived at that apartment complex. Maybe Ethan had a friend I didn't know about. Maybe there was an innocent explanation I hadn't considered. But I knew there wasn't. I knew in my gut what was happening, even if I didn't have photographic proof yet. The next morning, Dennis called with an update. Ethan had left the apartment around 7 and gone to the gym, then to work. The apartment was registered to a woman named Bethany Flores. She was 28, divorced, worked part-time at a medical office, and taught Sunday school at Cornerstone Community Church. Dennis had photos of Ethan entering and leaving the apartment. He asked if I wanted him to keep investigating or if I had what I needed. I told him to document a few more days and get as much evidence as possible. I called Leah and told her everything. She was furious on my behalf, using language I'd never heard her use before about Ethan and his hypocrisy. She asked what I wanted to do with the information. I didn't know yet. Part of me wanted to confront Ethan immediately. Part of me wanted to keep gathering evidence until I had an airtight case. Part of me just wanted to burn everything down and walk away. Leah suggested I talk to a divorce attorney before making any decisions. She gave me the name of someone who specialized in high-conflict divorces, where one party tried to use religion as manipulation. I made an appointment for Friday afternoon, 3 days away. In the meantime, I had to pretend everything was normal. Ethan texted me asking how I was feeling and if we could talk. I responded with brief answers that didn't invite conversation. He said he was staying at his brother's for a few more days to give us both space. I knew he was lying, but I didn't call him on it yet. I needed time to plan my next move. That Sunday morning, I went to church alone. Ethan texted saying he wasn't ready to face me yet, but he'd be at the second service. I sat in our usual third-row seat watching people file in, wondering how many of them knew about the affair, whether Bethany had told friends, whether Ethan had been stupid enough to let it be obvious. Bethany arrived 10 minutes before service started, heading toward the Sunday school classrooms in the basement. She was pretty in an understated way, with long dark hair and a sweet face that looked trustworthy. She was wearing a modest dress that would satisfy the church dress code. She looked like every other young Christian woman trying to rebuild her life after divorce. She looked like someone I might have befriended under different circumstances. The worship music started, and I stood with everyone else, not singing, just watching the performance. Pastor Gerald took the stage and started his sermon about forgiveness and grace, about how Christians were called to show mercy because we'd been shown mercy. The irony wasn't lost on me. After service, I went downstairs to the Sunday school hallway and waited for Bethany to finish with her class. Kids streamed out clutching craft projects, and she stood at the door saying goodbye to each one. When the last child left, I walked into the classroom. Bethany looked up with a friendly smile that faltered when she saw my expression. "Can I help you?" she asked carefully. I told her I was Claire, Ethan's wife. The color drained from her face. I said I knew about them and I wanted to hear her version of events before I confronted my husband. She tried to deny it at first, saying I'd misunderstood something. I told her I had credit card statements and surveillance photos, and I knew Ethan had been at her apartment multiple nights this week. She sat down heavily in one of the small classroom chairs, her hands shaking. "I didn't know he was lying to you about where he was staying," she said quietly. "He told me you two were separating and he needed space to figure things out." I almost laughed. Of course he'd told her we were separating. That was the oldest line in the cheater's playbook. I asked her how long it had been going on. She said 6 months. They'd started talking after she'd asked Ethan for advice about her divorce. He'd been so kind and understanding, helping her process her grief over her failed marriage. The emotional affair had turned physical 3 months ago. He'd told her he was unhappy in his marriage, that we'd grown apart spiritually, that he'd been praying about whether to stay. Everything he'd told her was carefully crafted to make him the victim, and me the obstacle to his happiness. I asked if she knew I'd been pregnant. Her face crumpled and she nodded. Ethan had told her we'd lost the baby, and it was probably for the best since our marriage was ending anyway. Those words, probably for the best, made rage flood through me so intensely I had to grip the edge of a table. He'd said that about our baby, to his mistress, while I was home bleeding and grieving. Bethany was crying now, saying she was sorry, that she'd never meant to be the other woman, that Ethan had made it sound like I was the problem. I told her we weren't separating and we hadn't been having problems until he'd started lying and sneaking around, that he'd gaslit both of us. Bethany asked what I was going to do. I said I was filing for divorce and she could have him because I was done. Then I walked out of the Sunday school classroom and straight to my car. I sat in the parking lot shaking with adrenaline and fury. My phone rang. It was Ethan asking where I was, saying he'd seen my car in the parking lot at the early service. I told him to meet me at home immediately. He started to argue, but I hung up. I drove home and waited in the kitchen, my mind surprisingly clear now that everything was out in the open. Ethan arrived 20 minutes later, looking wary. He started to ask what was going on, but I cut him off. I said I knew about Bethany. I knew about the apartment and the credit card and all of it. I watched his face cycle through denial and defensiveness, and something that might have been relief that he could finally stop pretending. He tried to explain, but I held up my hand. I told him I didn't want to hear excuses or justifications. I wanted him to pack his things and leave for real this time, not just pretend to stay at his brother's while he shacked up with his girlfriend. Ethan's defensive walls came up immediately. He said I'd driven him to this with my coldness and lack of spiritual submission, that he'd needed someone who understood him and appreciated his leadership. I felt something snap inside me. I asked him if fucking Bethany while I was pregnant with his child was part of God's plan, if the affair was divine purpose, if cheating on his wife was the spiritual leadership he was so proud of. He opened his mouth and nothing came out. I continued, my voice deadly calm. I told him he'd stood in a hospital room and prayed about God's will while our baby was dying. He'd quoted scripture and told me to trust divine timing. He'd made me feel guilty for grieving wrong. And the whole time he'd been sleeping with another woman. Every sermon he'd given me about faith and trust had been coming from a man who was betraying me daily. I asked him again if the affair was God's plan, if his lies were part of some greater purpose. He still had no answer. His face was red and his jaw was clenched, but he couldn't say a single word because we both knew there was no theological justification for what he'd done. He tried a different approach. He said everyone made mistakes, and Christians were supposed to forgive. That throwing away our marriage without trying to work through this was ungodly. I told him I'd already talked to a divorce attorney and filed papers that morning, that he'd get served at work within the next few days. His eyes widened and he switched to anger, saying I was vindictive and hateful, that I'd regret destroying our marriage and our reputation in the community. I pointed out that he'd destroyed both of those things himself when he'd started his affair, that I was just making it official. He said people at church wouldn't believe me, that he'd been there longer and had more credibility. I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos Dennis had taken. Ethan entering Bethany's apartment. Ethan leaving early in the morning. The credit card statements with all the charges. I told him I had 6 months of evidence and Bethany's confession, that if he tried to make me look bad, I'd show everyone exactly who he really was. His face went pale. He asked what I wanted. I said I wanted him out of the house tonight, and I wanted an uncontested divorce with a fair division of assets. No fighting, no dragging it out, no trying to use the church to pressure me into staying. Ethan tried to negotiate, but I was done negotiating. I told him he had 2 hours to pack whatever he needed and leave, that if he gave me any trouble, I'd send all the evidence to Pastor Gerald and every elder at church. I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of spiritual leader he actually was. He looked at me like he'd never seen me before, like I'd suddenly become someone he didn't recognize. Good, I thought. I didn't want him to recognize me. The version of me he'd known was too willing to accept his manipulation and perform the role of submissive Christian wife while he did whatever he wanted. That version had died in a church bathroom while I miscarried our baby. This version didn't have patience for his games anymore. Ethan went upstairs and I heard him moving around in the bedroom, opening drawers and closets. He came down 40 minutes later with 2 suitcases and his laptop bag. He tried one more time to convince me this was a mistake, that we could work through this if I just had faith. I told him to leave. He walked out the door and I locked it behind him, then sat down on the floor and cried harder than I'd cried since the miscarriage. The divorce papers were served to Ethan at his office on a Wednesday morning. I know because he called me immediately, furious that I'd embarrassed him at work. I reminded him that he'd embarrassed himself by having an affair and I was just handling the paperwork. He said he wanted to fight the divorce, that he still loved me and wanted to make it work. I told him too late and hung up. My attorney called that afternoon to say Ethan had contacted her office wanting to negotiate. I told her there was nothing to negotiate. I wanted the house and my car and my personal belongings. He could have everything else. She said most of his assets were likely tied up in the secret credit card debt anyway, and we'd need to figure out how to divide that. I told her to put all of it in his name. He'd racked up the debt for his affair. He could pay it off himself. She said that wasn't quite how marital debt worked, but she'd do her best. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged paperwork and financial statements. Ethan tried to claim he couldn't afford to move out and needed to stay in the house. My attorney shut that down quickly with evidence that he had another residence available. The church found out about the divorce faster than I'd expected. Pastor Gerald called asking if we could meet to discuss our marital problems. I told him there was nothing to discuss, that Ethan had been having an affair for 6 months, and I was filing for divorce. There was a long silence on the phone. Then Pastor Gerald asked if I had proof of the affair, or if this was just suspicion based on misunderstanding. The implication was clear. He didn't believe me or didn't want to believe me because Ethan was one of his promising young leaders. I told Pastor Gerald I had surveillance photos, credit card statements, and a confession from the other woman. Another long silence. He said adultery was certainly biblical grounds for divorce, but the church encouraged couples to pursue reconciliation first, to seek counseling and prayer. I told him Ethan had been lying to me while I miscarried our baby, and I had no interest in reconciling with someone capable of that level of cruelty. Pastor Gerald's tone shifted to disapproval. He said bitterness was understandable, but I needed to guard my heart against letting it consume me. That even in justified anger, Christians were called to show grace. I hung up on him. Within a week, word had spread through the entire church. People I'd considered friends stopped calling. Women I'd been in Bible study with for years suddenly had no time to meet for coffee. Ethan's version of events was circulating, painting me as unstable after the miscarriage and unwilling to work on our marriage. People were choosing sides, and most of them were choosing his because he'd been more strategic about his church relationships. I'd been quieter, less visible, more focused on genuine connection than networking. Now that worked against me. Leah called to tell me she'd heard someone say at church that I'd driven Ethan to have an affair by being cold and unforgiving, that I'd refused to fulfill my biblical role as his helper. The revisionist history being created made me furious, but I forced myself not to care. These people had shown me who they were. They were more interested in maintaining the appearance of a godly marriage than supporting someone who'd been betrayed. I stopped going to church entirely, deleted every church group chat, blocked everyone except Leah, who'd stood by me through all of it. The miscarriage follow-up appointment happened 2 weeks after Ethan moved out. I went alone to my OB's office and sat in the waiting room surrounded by pregnant women rubbing their bellies and comparing due dates. The nurse called me back and took my vitals without making eye contact. Word had probably spread here too about my divorce. Small town, small medical community, everyone knew everyone else's business. The doctor examined me and confirmed everything had healed properly. My hormone levels were back to normal. Physically, I could try to get pregnant again whenever I was ready. She asked gently how I was doing emotionally, and I told her I was getting divorced. She nodded like this wasn't surprising. She said miscarriage put tremendous strain on marriages and sometimes revealed cracks that were already there. That was the kindest way anyone had framed it. Most people acted like I was throwing away my marriage over one mistake. This doctor understood that the affair hadn't been the problem, just the symptom of deeper dysfunction I'd been ignoring. The divorce proceeded faster than expected, because Ethan didn't fight it. His attorney advised him that the evidence against him was damning, and any attempt to contest the divorce would only make him look worse. We agreed to divide assets, with me keeping the house and my car, him taking his car and his personal belongings. The credit card debt in his name stayed in his name. We had no kids, so custody wasn't an issue. The only sticking point was spousal support. Ethan's attorney argued that I made more money than him, and should help support him during the transition. My attorney laughed and pointed out that Ethan had spent thousands on his affair and could ask his girlfriend to support him instead. The judge agreed. No spousal support in either direction. The divorce was finalized 90 days after I'd filed. I got the notification from my attorney on a Thursday afternoon. I was officially single again after 5 years of marriage. I sat in my office at work staring at the email and felt nothing. Not relief or sadness or anger, just a hollow emptiness where my marriage used to be. That weekend, I started redecorating the house. I painted the bedroom a different color and bought new bedding. I moved furniture around and got rid of anything that reminded me too much of Ethan. Leah came over to help, and we turned it into a project, taking down the scripture verses he'd had framed on the walls and replacing them with art I actually liked. I found the pregnancy book still on the shelf and threw it away without opening it. In the back of the closet, I found the box of baby clothes I'd started collecting before the miscarriage. Tiny onesies and soft blankets I'd picked out, imagining who our baby would become. I sat on the closet floor holding them and cried, mourning not just the baby but the entire future I'd thought I was building. Leah found me there and sat beside me, not trying to fix it or explain it away, just sitting with me in the grief until I was ready to pack everything away. I donated the baby items to a pregnancy resource center, hoping some other mother could use them for a child who'd actually be born. The hardest part wasn't the divorce or the affair or even the miscarriage. It was rebuilding my entire sense of identity. I'd been a wife, an almost mother, and church member, and all of those things had been stripped away within a month. I had to figure out who Claire was outside of those roles. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in religious trauma. She helped me unpack how the church's teachings had shaped my understanding of worth and relationships. How I'd been taught that submission meant accepting whatever my husband decided, that questioning leadership was rebellion, that suffering was noble, and divorce was failure. She helped me see that those teachings had made me vulnerable to Ethan's manipulation. That healthy faith didn't require checking your brain or dignity at the door. We worked through the guilt I felt about not trying harder to save my marriage, about whether I should have confronted Ethan sooner, or looked the other way, or done something different. She told me repeatedly that his choices were his own, that I hadn't caused the affair by failing to be perfect, that sometimes people showed you who they really were, and the healthiest thing to do was believe them. 6 months after the divorce, I ran into Ethan at a grocery store. He was with Bethany, pushing a cart together like any normal couple. She looked uncomfortable when she saw me, but Ethan met my eyes directly. He looked different, less polished, more tired, like the strain of maintaining his image had finally caught up with him. We stood there for an awkward moment before he spoke. He said he'd been wanting to reach out to apologize properly, that he'd handled everything badly and hurt me in ways he was only starting to understand. I asked if he was still telling people the miscarriage was God's plan. His face flushed, and he said he'd been wrong to frame it that way, that he'd been using theology to avoid dealing with real emotions and real consequences. Bethany looked at him in surprise, like this was new information to her too. I told Ethan I didn't need his apology because I'd already moved on, that what he'd done had actually freed me from a marriage that was slowly suffocating me, that in a twisted way, the affair had been the best thing that could have happened because it forced me to wake up and leave. He looked stung by that and tried to say something else, but I walked away. I didn't owe him closure or forgiveness or anything else. Later that night, I told my therapist about the encounter, and she asked how it felt to see him. I said it felt like looking at a stranger, someone I used to know but didn't have any connection to anymore. She said that was healthy progress, that healing didn't mean you stopped hurting. It meant you stopped letting the person who hurt you have power over your emotional state. I'd reached a place where Ethan's opinion of me didn't matter, where his presence didn't send me spiraling, where I could see him with his girlfriend at a grocery store and just feel sorry for both of them because I knew firsthand what he was capable of. Bethany would learn eventually if she hadn't already. Cheaters showed you exactly who they were. You just had to be willing to look. A year after the divorce, I left Cornerstone Community Church officially. I'd stopped attending months before, but I'd never formally removed my membership. I wrote a letter to the elders explaining why I was leaving. I detailed Ethan's affair and the church's response, how leadership had prioritized his reputation over my pain, how people I'd trusted had chosen sides based on who was more valuable to the church community rather than who was telling the truth, how the teachings about submission and forgiveness had been weaponized to make me feel guilty for protecting myself. I sent the letter certified mail and copied Pastor Gerald. I never got a response, but I heard through Leah that it had caused some upheaval. Several other women had come forward with similar stories of being failed by church leadership when they'd experienced abuse or betrayal. The elders had been forced to have some uncomfortable conversations about how they handled marriage crises. Nothing would probably change systemically, but at least the conversation was happening. 2 years after the miscarriage, I was ready to try dating again. I'd rebuilt my life carefully, surrounding myself with people who valued honesty over appearance. I'd found a new church that was smaller and less concerned with projecting perfect families. I'd advanced at work and bought new furniture and adopted a dog who slept on my bed. I felt solid in ways I never had during my marriage. Dating was strange at first. I'd met Ethan in college and married him at 23, so I'd never really dated as an adult. The apps were confusing and exhausting. Most first dates went nowhere, but eventually I met someone named Marcus through a friend of Leah's. He was a teacher, divorced with 2 kids who lived with their mom. He was kind and funny and direct about what he wanted. We took things slowly, both of us gun-shy from previous relationships. He never quoted scripture at me or tried to position himself as my spiritual leader. He just wanted to know me as a person and build something genuine. 4 years after my marriage fell apart, I got pregnant again. This time it was planned and wanted and scary in entirely different ways. Marcus held my hand at the first ultrasound when we heard the heartbeat, his face full of wonder and terror. I cried because this felt so different from the last time. This felt like partnership instead of performance. The pregnancy was textbook normal. Every appointment showed a healthy baby developing on schedule. But I couldn't relax. I waited for something terrible to happen, for my body to fail again, for God or the universe or random chance to take this away too. My therapist helped me work through the anxiety, reminding me that this pregnancy wasn't the last one, that I wasn't the same person I'd been then. That trauma made us hypervigilant, but I could choose how much power to give it. At 32 weeks, Marcus and I got married in a tiny courthouse ceremony with Leah and his best friend as witnesses. No elaborate church wedding, no performance for a community that didn't actually care about us. Just 2 people making promises to each other that they actually meant. Our daughter was born healthy 2 months later, screaming and perfect. Marcus cried holding her, and I felt something shift in my chest. This was what partnership looked like. This was what it meant to build a family with someone who showed up emotionally instead of just spiritually. Someone who saw me as an equal instead of a project. someone who understood that terrible things happen sometimes, and the only appropriate response was to hold each other through it, without trying to make it mean something it didn't. 5 years after my first marriage ended, I heard through a friend that Ethan and Bethany had split up. Apparently, he'd been caught having another affair with someone from their new church. The pattern had repeated because people who used religion to justify their behavior rarely changed the behavior. They just found new theology to hide behind and new communities to perform for. I felt sorry for Bethany, but not surprised. She'd gotten exactly what she'd signed up for when she'd believed his lies about me. I'd moved on completely by then, building a life that was nothing like the one I'd imagined at 23. Better in some ways, harder in others, but entirely mine. When people asked about my first marriage, I told them the truth, that my husband had an affair while I was pregnant and I'd left, that the church had failed me spectacularly, that I'd had to rebuild everything from scratch. Some people were uncomfortable with that honesty, wanted me to soften it or focus on the redemption narrative, but I refused to make my story prettier than it was. The truth was complicated and painful and ultimately about survival, about choosing yourself when everyone else tells you that's selfish, about naming manipulation even when it comes wrapped in scripture, about grieving losses that were never your fault, and building a future anyway. That was my story, and I'd earned every difficult word of it. Standing in my kitchen 6 years after everything fell apart, I watched my daughter eating breakfast while Marcus made coffee and my dog begged for scraps. This ordinary morning, this simple life, this small family I'd built from wreckage felt like the truest thing I'd ever known. No performance, no pretense, just people showing up for each other imperfectly and honestly. Ethan had told me the miscarriage was God's plan, and I'd asked if his affair was too. He'd had no answer because there wasn't one. Some things didn't have neat theological explanations. Sometimes people were just cruel or selfish or broken, and they hurt the people closest to them. Sometimes the only plan was to survive the hurt and build something better on the other side. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.